I'm Paula, I'm 38, and at 12 my father beat me so hard he broke my uterus. It wasn't an accident, it was punishment, because I refused to clean up my mother's blood after she aborted. This is what happens when a woman dirties herself, my father said while I bled on the floor. My mother didn't call an ambulance. She gave me a towel and told me to learn the lesson. I didn't learn the lesson they wanted. I learned I would never be a biological mother, that my body at 12 had already been decided for me. I spent 26 years with that knowledge, with the rage, with the certainty that if I ever had the chance to be a mother, I would be different, I would be only mine. At 35 I adopted Mateo. 7 years old from an orphanage, quiet, with eyes that didn't trust. My parents, who hadn't spoken to me in 10 years, appeared at my door. You can't raise a child alone, my mother said. You don't have maternal instinct, my father said. We taught you that. And I, with Mateo hiding behind my leg, felt the rage of 12 years old return. But this time I didn't bleed. This time I took out the document I had kept for 26 years, the original medical report, with my father's signature as witness to the domestic accident. The photograph a nurse took in secret, my face swollen, my body covered in bruises. And the letter my mother wrote that the same nurse saved, where my mother thanked the doctor for not reporting this. My husband is a good man, the girl is problematic. I didn't confront them with words. I confronted them with Mateo, with his hand in mine, with his question out loud, clear from a 7-year-old. Mom, who are these people? Why do you hurt when they talk? Because Mateo, in 3 months, had learned to read me better than they had in 26 years. And in that question, in that hand, in that mutual protection that needed no explanation, I found the answer that didn't need documents. They're ghosts, I told him. And ghosts can't touch those who are alive. I grew up in a house where violence was education. My father, Ramon, was a mechanic with hands that could fix engines and break bones with equal precision. He was a man of routine, of discipline, of the belief that the world operated on rules that he enforced. Breakfast at 6, work at 7, dinner at 6, bed at 9. Deviations were not tolerated, questions were not encouraged. Emotions were not acknowledged except as problems to be solved, usually with volume, usually with force, usually with the belt that hung on a hook by the door like a warning. My mother, Beatriz, was a woman who had learned that survival meant collaboration. She was not cruel by nature, but she had become cruel by necessity, or by choice, or by the slow erosion of whatever resistance she might once have possessed. She cleaned, she cooked, she managed the household with the efficiency of a general managing a retreat. She knew when to be present, when to be absent, when to offer a towel instead of a phone call. She had learned, as I would learn, that the only way to endure a violent man was to become his mirror, his echo, his accomplice in the destruction of anyone who defied him. I was the middle child, or would have been. An older brother, Carlos, had died at birth, a fact that was mentioned rarely but weighed heavily, that made me the replacement for a son who would have been preferred, that made my female existence a disappointment before I could disappoint. A younger sister, Lucia, was born when I was 4, and was taken away when I was 6, placed with an aunt who could care for her better. A decision that was never explained, that I understood only later as part of the pattern of elimination, of the removal of anything that complicated Ramon's vision of order. I was 12 when I found her. In the bathroom, early morning, before the routine began, before the house woke to its disciplined rhythm. The door was ajar, which was unusual. Privacy was not a concept in our house, but Beatriz was usually careful about appearances, about maintaining the surface of normalcy that allowed the violence beneath to continue undisturbed. The blood was on the floor. On her thighs. In the toilet, a mass that I didn't understand but recognized as something that had been alive, something that had been expelled, something that represented a failure of control that Ramon would not tolerate. Beatriz was pale, sweating, her face a mask of pain and resignation, and something that might have been relief. The complex expression of a woman who had done this before, who knew the procedure, who understood the cost, and accepted it as the price of her continued existence. She had aborted. Not her first, I would learn later. The third or fourth or fifth, the unwanted daughters that Ramon demanded she eliminate because he wanted sons, because daughters were expense, because women who can't control their wombs are dirty. I would find out, years later, through whispered conversations with aunts, through medical records that Beatriz had kept hidden, through the slow accumulation of evidence that painted a picture of systematic elimination, of a woman who had been pregnant 7 times and had been allowed to keep only one living child, me, and only because I had survived the violence that was supposed to control me. Ramon found me in the doorway. He didn't ask what I had seen. He didn't explain, he simply ordered. "Clean it up. The floor, the toilet, everything. Your mother needs to rest. This is women's work." I refused. I was 12, horrified, confused, unable to process what I was seeing but certain that I should not be the one to erase it. Certain that the blood was not dirt, that the mass was not garbage, that the scene before me was not a mess to be cleaned but a tragedy to be witnessed. I had never defied Ramon directly. I had learned to avoid, to delay, to perform compliance while maintaining internal resistance. But this was too much. The blood, the pain, the implicit accusation in Ramon's order that I should participate in the erasure of my mother's suffering was beyond my capacity to obey. Ramon used his belt. Not the buckle, which would have been too obvious, too easily documented, too difficult to explain as the domestic accident it would become. The strap, the leather, the flexible weapon that could break internal organs without leaving the marks that would require explanation. He aimed for my abdomen, my pelvis, the parts of me that he had already decided were problematic, that would eventually become dangerous, that needed to be controlled before they could defy him. The first blow knocked me down. I fell against the bathtub, my head ringing, my vision blurring. The second, third, fourth, fifth came in rapid succession, each one precise, each one directed, each one accompanied by the same words, repeated like a mantra, like a lesson, like the education he believed he was providing. This is what happens, this is what happens, this is what happens. I bled. I didn't understand that the bleeding was internal, that the damage was permanent, that my screams were not just from pain but from the destruction of something I didn't know I had. I fainted, the world narrowing to a point of darkness, the sounds of Ramon's voice and Beatrice's silence fading into nothing. I woke in a hospital. A nurse, young, with dark circles under her eyes and a name tag that read Alina, was holding my hand. She was taking photographs, quick, furtive, with a camera she kept hidden in her pocket. She was saving a letter, folded small, that Beatrice had written while Ramon was explaining to the doctor that I had fallen down the stairs. The doctor, complicit or terrified, accepted the explanation. The nurse, braver than the system, documented what she could. The pain was everywhere, not just the bruises on my arms and legs, the swelling on my face, the cuts from where I had hit the bathtub. A deeper pain in my center, in my pelvis, in the place where I would later understand my uterus had been, where it had been whole and was now ruptured, where blood was accumulating in spaces that should not contain it, where my body was failing in ways that would not be fully explained for years. The hysterectomy was emergency, necessary, performed on a child who didn't understand why she was in surgery, why her parents were not there when she woke, why she was being told to rest and not worry and forget this happened. The doctors spoke in codes, in euphemisms, in the careful language of adults who are protecting children from knowledge they believe the children cannot handle. A procedure. A complication. You'll be fine. I woke without the organ I didn't know I had lost, without the possibility I didn't know I had possessed, without the future that had been erased while I was unconscious, while Ramon was completing his explanation, while Beatrice was writing her letter of thanks to the doctor who had not reported, who had accepted the narrative, who had preserved the order that Ramon demanded. The recovery was weeks. Ramon visited once, briefly, to tell me that I had learned an important lesson about obedience and respect. Beatrice visited more frequently, to bring food, to change bandages, to maintain the appearance of maternal care that she had learned to perform. She never spoke of what happened, never asked how I felt, never acknowledged that the blood on the bathroom floor was connected to the blood in my abdomen, that her abortions and my beating were part of the same system, the same violence, the same determination to control women's bodies regardless of their will. I returned home. The bathroom was clean, the floor was white, the toilet was pristine. The blood had been erased, the mass had been removed, the evidence had been destroyed. I walked past it every day, used it every morning, performed my own routines in the same space where I had been broken and learned to act as if nothing had happened. At 14, I menstruated, or rather, I didn't. The absence was noted, discussed with Beatrice, dismissed as irregularity, stress, normal for your age. I was given vitamins, told to exercise, instructed not to worry. I didn't worry. I didn't know to worry. I didn't know that menstruation was connected to the organ I no longer had, that its absence was not irregularity but impossibility, that my body was not delayed but destroyed. At 16, a doctor independent of my parents' network told me the truth. I was at a clinic for a school physical, a requirement for participation in sports that I didn't want to play but had to attempt. The doctor, an older woman with kind eyes and direct questions, reviewed my history, noted the hysterectomy, asked about the circumstances. I told her what I had been told. I fell down the stairs. There were complications. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she showed me the file, the surgical report which I had never seen, the description of the rupture, the emergency procedure, the removal of the uterus and one ovary, the damage to the remaining ovary that would prevent hormone production, the medical certainty that I would never bear children, that I would require hormone replacement for life, that my body at 16 was in many ways older than hers at 60. "You didn't fall down the stairs," she said. Not as a question. As a statement. As a recognition of something she had seen before, something she knew, something that was not rare but was rarely acknowledged. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The knowledge was too large, too fundamental, too destructive of everything I had built to survive. I left the clinic, went home, confronted my parents. Ramon denied. Beatrice cried. The performance was the same as always, the denial, the deflection, the transformation of my accusation into my fault, my exaggeration, my inability to understand what had been done for my own good. I left at 22. Packed a bag, took a bus, found a room in a city where no one knew me, where no one knew Ramon, where I could begin the slow process of becoming someone else, someone who had not been beaten into infertility, someone who could imagine a future beyond the damage. I didn't speak to them for 10 years. Not out of anger, or not only anger, out of necessity. Out of the recognition that every conversation would be a return to the bathroom, to the blood, to the belt, to the lesson that I had refused to learn. Out of the need to build a self that was not defined by their violence, that could exist without their presence, that could become something other than their damaged daughter. I became a child therapist, specializing in trauma. The irony that I could not name, the specialization that was self-treatment that never quite worked. I helped children who had been beaten, who had been silenced, who had learned to distrust adults before they learned to read. I was good at it. I was present. I was patient. I was everything my parents had not been. I learned to sit with pain that was not mine, to hold space for grief that I could not fix, to witness the damage that adults inflicted on children, and to offer the possibility that the damage was not the definition, that the child could become someone other than what the adult had made. I offered this possibility without fully believing it for myself, without fully accepting that my own damage could be transformed, that my own future could be reclaimed. And I was empty. The emptiness of knowing I would never be a biological mother, not because of chance or disease, but because of a choice that had been made for me, a violence that had been directed at me, a future that had been stolen before I could imagine it. The emptiness of watching my clients grow, of seeing them become parents, of celebrating their pregnancies and their births, while knowing that these experiences would never be mine, that my body had been rendered incapable by a beating that was called education. I dated. Briefly, unsuccessfully, with the careful distance of someone who knows that intimacy requires vulnerability and vulnerability requires trust and trust, has been systematically destroyed. I had relationships that ended before they began, connections that were severed by my own fear, my own anticipation of violence, my own inability to believe that anyone could want me without wanting to control me, to break me, to finish what Ramon had started. At 30, I began to consider adoption, not as compensation, not as replacement, but as possibility. As the assertion that motherhood was not biology, that love was not blood, that family was not the accident of birth but the deliberate construction of care. I researched, I attended seminars, I spoke with social workers who evaluated my suitability with the careful skepticism of professionals who have seen too many damaged people attempt to heal themselves through parenting. The process was slow, bureaucratic, invasive. Home studies, background checks, psychological evaluations, financial reviews. Each step required me to explain myself, to justify my capacity to care, to demonstrate that my damage would not become my child's damage. I performed compliance, as I had learned to perform it, while maintaining internal resistance to the implication that my infertility made me suspect, that my history of violence made me risky, that my choice to parent was something that required more justification than the biological accidents that created most families. At 35, I was approved. Not celebrated, not congratulated, but permitted. The permission felt like another performance, another evaluation, another moment of being measured against standards that were not applied to others. But I accepted it. I accepted the permission and the implication and the careful construction of legitimacy that the system required. I found Mateo at 7. An orphanage in a city I didn't know, a building that smelled of industrial cleaner and institutional food, and the particular sadness of children who have learned not to expect. He was quiet, with eyes that did not trust, that had been returned twice by families who couldn't handle him, who had found his silence disturbing, his distance threatening, his refusal to perform gratitude unacceptable. I recognized him. The same isolation, the same distrust, the same early knowledge that adults fail, that promises break, that the world is not safe for children who need it to be. I saw myself in him, not as mirror but as parallel, as another version of the same damage, as a child who had learned to survive by becoming small, by becoming quiet, by becoming someone who did not require attention because attention was dangerous. The first months were difficult. Mateo did not speak. He did not eat in my presence. He slept with the light on, the door closed, the blankets arranged in a fortress that protected him from threats he could not name. He flinched when I moved too quickly, when I raised my voice even to call from another room, when I approached him while he was focused on something else. He was always watching, always evaluating, always preparing for the violence that experience had taught him to expect. I did not force. I did not demand. I did not perform the maternal expectations that I had learned from watching Beatriz, the efficient care that masked absence, the physical presence that disguised emotional distance. I waited. I sat. I read beside him in silence my own book while he looked at pictures he didn't understand or pretended to understand or used as shield against interaction. I cooked meals that he didn't eat. I left them on the table, retreated to another room, returned to find them gone. The plate empty, the evidence of consumption erased as if it had never happened. I changed sheets that were not dirty, made beds that were already made, performed the routines of care that I had learned from watching others, from reading books, from the professional knowledge that I applied to my clients but had never applied to myself. One evening, after 3 weeks of silence, I was reading in the living room when Mateo appeared in the doorway. He didn't enter. He stood, watching, his body tense, his eyes calculating. I continued reading, or pretended to continue, aware of his presence but unwilling to demand acknowledgement, to force interaction, to replicate the violence of expectation that had damaged me. "Why don't you yell?" he asked. The voice was small, rough from disuse, hesitant from disbelief that speaking was permitted, that questions were allowed, that his curiosity would not be punished. I looked up. I set down my book. I considered the question, which was not simple, which contained multitudes, which was the distillation of his experience and his hope and his fear. Because no one yelled for me when I needed it, I answered. And I learned that yelling doesn't help. He didn't respond. He didn't move, but something shifted, some tension that I couldn't name but could feel, some opening that was not acceptance but possibility. He turned and walked away, back to his room, back to his fortress. But the door that night was not fully closed. It remained ajar, a crack of light, an invitation that I did not accept but noted, that I respected by not approaching, by not pushing, by not demanding. The next morning he was at the table when I brought breakfast. Not eating, not speaking, but present. The morning after he took a piece of toast. The morning after that he asked for juice. Slowly, incrementally, with the careful progression of someone who is testing boundaries, who is evaluating safety, who is learning to trust not because trust has been earned, but because the absence of violence has been confirmed. He began to speak. Not to me at first, but to himself, to his toys, to the books he looked at but didn't read. Mutterings, observations, comments that were not directed at me but were audible, that were offered as gifts that I could accept or reject, that tested whether I would listen without demanding, hear without correcting, acknowledge without controlling. Then he began to speak to me. Questions about the apartment, about the neighborhood, about the rules that I had established and that he was learning to navigate. Not challenges, not defiance, but information gathering, the careful collection of data that would allow him to predict, to anticipate, to survive in this new environment that was not yet safe but was not yet dangerous. He began to eat in my presence. Not at the table at first, but in the same room, his plate on the floor while he sat on the couch, his back to me but his body angled so he could see me if he chose. Then at the table, but not across from me, at the corner, the diagonal that allowed proximity without confrontation. Then across from me, his eyes meeting mine briefly, then looking away, then meeting again, the gradual construction of connection that was not intimacy but possibility. He began to sleep with the light off. Not immediately, not completely, but progressively. First dimmed, then off but with the hallway light on, then off with the door closed, then off with the door open. Each change was his choice, his decision, his evaluation that the darkness was not threatening, that the closed door was not trapping, that the open door was not inviting intrusion. And he began to read me, to watch my breathing, my posture, my hands, to notice when I was tense, when I was tired, when I was hurt by something I didn't name, to ask sometimes, "Are you okay?" in a voice that was small but direct, that was concerned but not intrusive, that offered care without demanding response. In 3 months, Mateo read me better than anyone had in my entire life. Better than my therapists, who had professional distance. Better than my colleagues, who had professional boundaries. Better than my rare partners, who had their own damage and their own defenses. He read me because he needed to, because survival required understanding, because the child who had been returned twice had learned that adults were unpredictable, and that prediction was protection. He knew when I was thinking of Ramon. He could tell by the set of my shoulders, the rhythm of my breathing, the way my hands would find each other and hold on as if preventing separation. He knew when I was thinking of the beating, of the blood, of the bathroom that was clean but never erased. He knew, and he would appear not speaking, not touching but present, sitting near me, offering his company without demanding mine, his presence without requiring response. And he knew when my parents appeared. Before I knew, before I heard, before the doorbell rang. He knew from my tension, my anticipation, my unconscious preparation for violence that I didn't consciously expect. He knew, and he positioned himself, and he was ready when the doorbell finally sounded. Ramon and Beatriz. 10 years of silence, of absence, of the pretense that I did not exist, that they had not damaged me, that their violence was justified and their control legitimate. They had learned of the adoption through my aunt, the one who still spoke to me, who still believed in family reconciliation, who did not know the full story but knew enough to be dangerous. She had mentioned it in passing, at a family gathering I did not attend, a mention that reached Ramon and Beatriz through the network of information that families maintain even when they pretend to sever connection. They came to warn me. Not to celebrate, not to support, not to acknowledge that I had built something despite their destruction. To warn. To protect, as they would see it, to save me from a mistake that their violence had proven I was incapable of avoiding. "You can't raise a child alone," Beatriz said. She stood in the doorway, not entering, maintaining the boundary that I had not invited her to cross. She looked at me with the same eyes that had given me the towel, that had told me to learn the lesson, that had written the letter thanking the doctor for not reporting. Eyes that were not cruel but were complicit, not ignorant but were choosing ignorance, not damaged but were choosing to damage. "You don't have maternal instinct," Ramon said. He stood beside her, larger than I remembered, older, his hands still capable of precision but now slightly trembling, the tremor of age or illness or the accumulated cost of violence that had been directed outward for decades. "We taught you that." The reference was veiled but clear. "We taught you that you are not a mother, that your body does not serve, that your capacity to care was destroyed intentionally, that you should not attempt what we proved you cannot do." The lesson of the belt, the lesson of the blood, the lesson of the towel and the silence and the letter that thanked the doctor for complicity. I felt the rage of 12 years old return. The physical memory of the belt, the blood, the pain, the destruction. The emotional memory of betrayal, of abandonment, of the mother who chose the father over the daughter, who chose silence over protection, who chose complicity over care. The rage that had been suppressed, that had been transformed into professional distance, into therapeutic patience, into the careful management of other people's damage while my own remained unaddressed. But I did not bleed. I did not faint. I did not perform the compliance that had been trained into me, the acceptance that had been beaten into me, the silence that had been purchased with my future. I had documents, the medical report with Ramon's signature as witness to the domestic accident. The photograph from Alina, the nurse who had dared to document what the system refused to see. The letter from Beatriz, thanking the doctor for not reporting, for protecting the good man who had beaten his daughter into infertility, for accepting the narrative that the girl was problematic and the violence was justified. I had kept them for 26 years. not knowing why, not having a plan, not anticipating confrontation or justice or resolution. Simply keeping them as evidence, as proof, as the documentation of a reality that had been denied, that had been erased, that had been transformed into a fall downstairs that never happened. But I did not use them. Mateo spoke first. "Mom," he said, his voice small but clear, his hand finding mine, his body pressing against my leg in the physical connection that we had built over months of careful approach and retreat. "Who are these people? Why do you hurt when they talk?" Because Mateo saw what I could not hide. The tension in my shoulders, the change in my breathing, the invisible but physical retreat that occurred when Ramon and Beatriz spoke. He had learned to read me, and he read me now, in real time, in the presence of the source of my damage, and he named what he saw with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to veil observation in politeness. "They're ghosts," I said, and the words were not metaphor for him. They were instruction. They were protection. They were the demonstration that I could name my parents as what they were, dead emotionally, though they breathed, and that Mateo could learn to do the same with whoever inherited their damage, with whatever ghosts appeared in his own future. Ramon and Beatriz looked at Mateo. At his hand in mine, at his question that was not a question but a shield, at his presence that demonstrated what they had denied. They looked at me, at the absence of bleeding, of fainting, of the power they had held at 12. They looked at the woman I had become, the mother I had chosen to be, the family I had constructed without their permission or their participation. And they left. They did not argue. They did not demand. They did not attempt to assert the control that had been their default, their expectation, their right as they understood it. They simply turned and walked away, down the hallway, down the stairs, out of the building, out of my life. They did not return. They had no power here in this space with this child who had learned in 3 months what they had never learned in 70 years. But I did something more. I used the documents, not for confrontation, but for construction. I created an archive, a collection, a resource that could be shared, that could teach, that could demonstrate the pattern of violence and the possibility of survival. I used them to create a center, a support system, a space for victims of childhood violence that results in infertility. I called it Mateo. Not named for my son, though he was part of it, but for the question he asked, the one that allowed me to name my parents as ghosts, the one that created the possibility of protection, the one that transformed confrontation into construction. The center grew, slowly at first, then with momentum, as women found us, as stories accumulated, as the pattern became visible and the survival became possible. Women who had been beaten, who had been silenced, who had been made infertile by violence that was called discipline, called education, called love. Women who had been told they were problematic, who had been given towels instead of ambulances, who had been thanked for learning lessons that were not lessons but destruction. We documented their stories, we connected them with adoption resources, we helped them understand that the inability to bear biological children was not the inability to mother, that the damage done to their bodies was not the definition of their capacity to care. And we helped them build families. Not biological, not traditional, but chosen, deliberate, constructed with the care that had been denied to them. Families that were not accidents of birth but acts of will, not inheritances of blood but creations of love, not the repetition of damage but the transformation of survival. Mateo grew with the center. He became its first volunteer, then its youth advocate, then its voice in schools and communities. He spoke about adoption, about trauma, about the families that are chosen rather than inherited. He did not speak about my parents, about the beating, about the specifics of my damage. He spoke about the principle that ghosts cannot touch the living, but the living can touch each other with care. He developed a presence, a confidence, a way of speaking that was not performance but truth. He connected with other children who had been adopted, who had been returned, who had learned to distrust before they learned to trust. He offered them what he had found. The possibility that adults could be different, that the damage of the past did not determine the future, that the choice to care was available even to those who had been cared for poorly. Years later, Mateo asked about my childhood photographs. Why there were so few, why there were none from before 12, why the earliest showed a face swollen, a body bruised, a child who did not smile. He had seen them, I knew, in the center's archive, in the documentation that I had made available, in the evidence that was used for teaching and for healing. I showed him the documents, the medical report, the photograph, the letter. I told him the story, not as accusation but as explanation, not as demand for sympathy but as offering of truth. He looked at them. He did not cry, he did not recoil. He asked, "Why did you keep them?" I answered, "To remember that I survived, and so you would know that ghosts cannot touch those who are alive, but documents can touch those who need to know they are not alone." Mateo, in silence, took the photographs. He scanned them. He uploaded them to a school project about families that are not what they seem. The project went viral in his community, then beyond. Not for the exposure of Ramon and Beatriz, who were irrelevant now, who had no power, who were fading into the obscurity they had earned, for the demonstration that a child who was adopted by a mother who could not have biological children, could choose to be family, could choose to protect, could choose to name damage without being destroyed by it. The response was overwhelming. Messages from adults who had been beaten, who had been made infertile, who had believed they were alone. Messages from children who had been adopted, who had been returned, who had finally found family. Messages from people who understood, without explanation, what Mateo had demonstrated, that the choice to care was more powerful than the violence that had preceded it, that the construction of family was more significant than the destruction of biology, that the living could touch each other in ways that ghosts could not prevent. I received a letter, years later, from a woman of 25. "My father beat me when I was 10. I cannot have children. I learned of your center. I want to adopt, but I am afraid that my damage will make me harmful. Can I be a mother?" I responded with a single sentence. "You can be a mother precisely because you know damage. Those who do not know damage are the ones who cause it. Those who know it are the ones who stop it." The woman adopted. She wrote again, a year later, with a photograph of a child, a girl, who had her eyes and someone else's smile. She wrote that the girl asked, on her first night, why she didn't yell. She had answered, without thinking, the same words I had given Mateo. "Because no one yelled for me when I needed it, and I learned that yelling doesn't help." The cycle, if it was a cycle, was not repetition. It was transformation. The same words passed from a damaged child to a damaged adult to another damaged child, becoming not the continuation of violence, but its interruption, its naming, its refusal. The same lesson, learned in blood and transformed into care, becoming not the replication of damage but its antidote, its opposite, its defeat. I am 45 now. Mateo is 17. He will leave soon, for college, for his own life, for the family he will choose or not choose. I will remain in the center, in the work, in the space that has become not just my profession but my home, not just my contribution but my identity. Ramon died last year. I learned through my aunt, the same one who had informed him of my adoption, the same one who still believed in family connection despite everything. I did not attend the funeral. I did not send flowers. I noted his death as I note the weather, as information that changes my calculations that I will process eventually or not at all. Beatriz is in a nursing facility. Frail, confused, sometimes asking for daughter who does not visit. I do not visit. I do not send flowers. I note her existence as I note the existence of clients who have completed their treatment, who have moved on, who no longer require my presence. I have not forgiven them. I have not forgotten them. I have simply become someone for whom their power has expired, whose damage has been transformed into the capacity to protect, whose absence of biological children has become the presence of chosen family, whose 12-year-old self, bleeding on the floor, has become the 45-year-old woman who can say with truth that ghosts cannot touch those who are alive. I continue to work. The center continues to grow. The women continue to find us, to tell their stories, to build their families, to transform their damage into care. The children continue to be adopted, to be chosen, to be loved by mothers who cannot bear them but who can raise them, who cannot create them but who can protect them, who cannot give them biology but who can give them truth. And I continue to be Paula, the therapist, the mother, the survivor, the woman who was beaten into infertility and who chose, despite that beating, despite that infertility, despite the ghosts who continue to breathe, to become someone who could care, who could protect, who could say with truth that the living are more powerful than the dead, that the chosen are more significant than the inherited, that the family constructed is more real than the family destroyed. If someone broke your body and called it teaching, if someone destroyed your future and called it love, if someone made you believe that your damage defined your capacity to care, hear me. Your damage does not define you. Your choice to care, despite the damage, despite the absence of models, despite the fear that you will replicate what was done to you. That choice is the only definition that matters. You can be a mother without biology. You can be a father without example. You can be family without inheritance. You can be alive, fully, finally, only yours. That's my story. If it spoke to you, comment below. If someone broke you and called it education, tell me. I'll read every word. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.